Hello again, class. Today's lesson will be the first in 2 or 3 lessons on the Constitution. Today we're going to focus on the actual Constitution itself. Our last series of lectures dealt with the Constitutional Convention, the compromises the delegates had to make, then on the ratification process, including the Federalist Papers. So we talked about how the Constitution was made and how it was agreed to. Now we're going to talk about what's actually in the Constitution. And as you can see, even though this is history class and we're studying things in history, this Constitution has been in place since 1787 and it's still the current Constitution. So although we're talking about it in the context of history and it being drafted and then ratified in the 1780s, it's still very much relevant today as it is the Constitution that we continue to use. Right. That's what it looked like. That's the at least a picture of it. And so you can see it was basically on one or a few large pieces of paper. They just wrote everything out. Once they filled up one side, they'd go to another. And so that's how it looks. And what it starts with, and you can see on that picture on the right, it starts with those 3 words, "we the people." All right, very, very famous phrase in American history and American jurisprudence. We the people. Talking about the Constitution. And it's because that's important because, remember, the Founding Fathers were creating a government not based on kings, not based on this idea that kings would rule people, but that people would create their own governments. People would be free and to create their own governments. So when they got around to writing this Constitution that would set up the U.S. government, they started it with "we the people." And this section at the first is called the Preamble. All right, the Preamble is just a fancy word for like an introduction. So this first paragraph of the Constitution is called the Preamble. And it starts with that phrase, as you can say, "we the people." And as you can say, "we the people of the United States in order to," and then we're going to go through this list that the drafters of the Constitution put. So they're starting the Constitution, basically going to explain why and what they're doing. All right, so it starts, "we the people." Again, this isn't about kings anymore. It's about people creating their own government. This idea of a social contract that we've been talking about ever since the beginning of school. That the people get to create their own social contract, set up the rules that they're going to live by. So we the people of the United States in order to, 1, form a more perfect union. Okay? Remember, you started with 13 colonies, then became 13 states, and throughout most of their history before the Constitution was written, those 13 colonies and states had been acting more or less independently from each other. Now you'd have the First Continental Congress and Second Continental Congress where the states started acting together for a common purpose, that being to defeat Britain. But there have always been separate entities, almost 13 little countries in effect. But here they're going to create a union. They're going to join together. All right, so we the people are creating this Constitution to make that union more perfect. 2, to establish justice. All right. So they're setting out the goals for this Constitution and essentially the goals for our government still in effect. It's supposed to create justice. To ensure domestic tranquility. Now here, the word domestic, maybe you've heard that in terms of referring to your house or someone's home. That's how we typically use the word domestic today. But here they're meaning it just to meaning here at sort of at home in the United States in effect. So when they're talking about domestic, they're talking about within the country itself. And tranquility just means peacefulness. All right, so they're trying to ensure or to make sure that there is peace within the United States. Again, go back to the Articles of Confederation. You had all these boundary disputes. between the states. The states were arguing over rivers and boundaries and things like that. So one of the reasons we're going to create this Constitution, at least from the founders' point of view, is to bring peacefulness between the states, to bring peacefulness within the United States. 4, provide for common defense. And first of all, let me tell you, that is not a typo. I did not misspell or mistype defense there. That's how they type the word defense there, with a C instead of an S. That's actually still how people in Britain spell the word defense. If you go over to England or London, they'd spell it like this. We in the United States now spell it with an S, but in the Constitution, it's spelled with a C. That was more of a common spelling, even within the United States in the 1700s. All right, so the 4th reason we're creating this Constitution is to provide for a common defense, so the states can defend each other. After all, that was what initially brought the states together in the first place, to defend themselves and to fight a war against Britain. 5, promote the general welfare. And welfare is just sort of like a people's well-being. All right, and so generally they're talking about, again, throughout the country, and so they're just trying to promote as much well-being throughout the country as possible. Again, they're not promising it. They're just going to promote it. All right, they're not promising everybody, is going to be at a certain level of happiness or wealth or anything like that. If you think back to the Declaration of Independence, those inalienable truths were life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This same concept is being talked about here. The government's going to promote the general welfare. Again, not promising it, but at least people can pursue their welfare, their well-being. 6, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. So again, think back to the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson wrote of inalienable rights, meaning life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Again, liberty is one of those inalienable rights. So fast forward now to the drafting of the Constitution 11 years later, and the founders are saying, all right, we're going to create this Constitution to secure, to bring about blessings of liberty, right, into ourselves and our posterity. Okay? So look at how all of these reasons for the government go back to the Declaration. You're going to have peacefulness and defense. That's basically protecting life. You're going to have general welfare. That's like pursuit of happiness. Here you're securing the blessings of liberty. Again, liberty being one of those inalienable rights back in the Declaration. All right, so you see there's a connection. All right, there's a connection to what Jefferson said a government should do to now what our government is supposed to do according to the Constitution. The drafters of the Constitution set out, here's the things we think the government should do. Here's what we're trying to do by creating a new government under this Constitution. And it goes back to those inalienable rights. All right. So number 6, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. What they mean by posterity, they're basically talking about us, you and me, their descendants, people in the future. So the Constitution, it's supposed to secure the blessings of liberty, not just to people who were alive in 1787, but to all future generations in America too. All right, so the founding fathers and the drafters of the Constitution are saying that, hey, we're going to create a government that's going to protect the liberty for basically everyone who lives in this country in the future as well. All right, so what are these 6 things, or why are they doing these 6 things? All right, the founders say, we the people are going to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and posterity. And therefore, what are they going to do? They're going to ordain and establish, just a fancy phrase for create, ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. All right, they're going to create and then ratify this Constitution. That's what they're hoping for. All right, so that's the preamble. That's basically a summary right at the beginning of the Constitution, where they're setting forth the 6 goals for our government. All right, so again, again, I know this is history class, but this Constitution is very much alive today. So whenever you see the government taking an action, you should view it within these 6 goals. Is this one of the 6 things the government's doing? Is it proper for the government to be doing this? Because the Constitution sets forth the reasons our government exists, basically. And they list them right there in the preamble, the very first thing. All right, so we have the goals of the Constitution set forth right there in the preamble. Now let's talk about woven within this Constitution, and we're going to talk about those specific terms in future lessons. But today, for the rest of this lecture, we're going to talk about there are 7 principles of our government. The Constitution sets forth 7 principles of government based on the Constitution. And those are popular sovereignty, republicanism, federalism, separation of powers, checks and balances, limited government, individual rights. All right, so make sure you know what these 7 principles are. These are the concepts that our government is based on. Again, we're getting rid of a monarchy, a government ruled by kings. We're getting rid of, dictatorship or totalitarianism, where government has total power. All right, think about like North Korea today. That's a dictator. That's a totalitarian. He has total power. That's not what we're supposed to have in this country. Our government's supposed to be based on these 7 principles. And we're going to talk about them one after the other here. So number 1, popular sovereignty. That is a government where people rule. Popular sovereignty. Popular basically refers to people. Sovereignty refers to ruling. Popular sovereignty is a government where people rule. Second, republicanism. This is a system where people rule by electing representatives. That's what we do in this country. We just had an election, and we went and elected representatives. Not just the president, who's basically supposed to be sort of a representative for everyone in the country, but each state elected representatives of Congress, senators, and House of Representative members. And so we, the people in this country, typically don't vote on individual or specific laws. Sometimes you do within your city or county, very limited in very limited times. But for the most part, we don't do that. We don't vote on our laws. We vote on the people who write the laws. And that's what a Republican form of government is, where the people elect their representatives to go make the laws for them. But the people are still in charge. Because if they don't like what those representatives are doing, they get to vote for someone else the next election. All right, the third principle is federalism. Our federalism is a government system where power is shared between a national and federal government and state or local governments. For example, only the federal government can declare war, regulate trade, or coin money. Okay? States can't do this. States don't have their own money. We don't have 50 different currencies in this country. States don't get to make their own rules about regulating trade. Now, if you think back and remember, under the Articles of Confederation, the states could do these things, but they can't anymore. All right? That's one of the ways that this Constitution is creating more power for the federal government and less power for the states. Same with declaring war. Obviously, it'd be a problem if 20 states decided to declare war on the country, but the 30 other states didn't. Nope, the national government, the federal government, has to declare war. So either all 50 states go to war at the same time, or none of them. Okay, so that's an example of federal government's specific powers under federalism, but the states have their own powers, like issuing professional licenses. All right. So states get to decide who can be a teacher or a lawyer in their state. All right, so if you get a license in Texas to be a teacher or to be a lawyer or something like that, that means you can work in Texas in that profession, But you can't necessarily go to Oklahoma and become a teacher or practice law. You'd have to go get a license in that state. So that's one of the things states do. States operate and regulate schools. All right. Texas, for the most part, makes the rules for schools in Texas. Okay. States conduct elections. All right. That's why, think back to the 2020 election and all the different states that were counting votes at different speeds in different areas. That's because the states are running the elections, basically. So now they obviously have to follow the Constitution in allowing people to vote and that sort of thing, but they get to run the actual elections themselves. And finally, remember, this is the sharing of power, so there are certain things that both governments can do. The easiest one to think is about issue taxes. If you're going to have a government, it's going to need money to operate, so therefore it's going to have to tax. This was the whole problem with the Articles of Confederation. The federal government couldn't tax. So they could raise an army, or they could declare that we had an army, but they couldn't pay for it. If you're going to have a government, it's going to have a way to collect money so it can operate. So both federal and state governments can issue taxes. They issue separate kinds of taxes usually, but they do both issue taxes. All right, so that's the concept of federalism. Very important concept. Now we're going to talk about two other concepts. They're related, but they are different. First, just separation of powers. This is the easier one to think about. We have three branches of government, and power is divided among those three branches. Again, separation of powers. That's pretty easy to think of. Each branch of government, the executive branch, the legislative branch, the judicial branch, have separate powers. What's a little more complicated is this idea of checks and balances. All right, checks and balances are a system where the different branches of government limit, and another name for limiting is checking, or another word for limit is to check, and balance each other's power. All right, so, in other words, you have three branches of government. Each branch is supposed to make sure that the other two branches don't become too powerful, don't go beyond what they're allowed to do under the Constitution. All right, what are some examples of this? Well, the legislative branch, as you know, writes laws. So Congress writes laws, but those laws only go into effect if the president signs them. The president has to sign the law. So if the president does not agree to a specific law, the president can veto that law. And that's what we call the veto power. Right? V-E-T-O. President basically can write veto on the bill. Instead of signing it, he gets to write veto and the law does not go into effect. Unless Congress does what we call override the veto. All right, so Congress passes a law. The president doesn't like the law, so the president writes veto on that. The president vetoes that law so it doesn't go into effect. But Congress can vote on that law again. And if 2/3 of Congress vote for that law, all right, so that would mean 67 out of the 100 senators, and I don't know the exact number for congresspersons, but probably about 300 of the 435 persons in the House of Representatives votes for that law. Then the president's veto is overridden. That's what we call it, overridden. And in that instance, if Congress does override the president's veto, the law gets to go into effect even if the president vetoed it. Another example, the president appoints judges or justices. That's what they're called at the Supreme Court. In other courts, they're called judges, but at the Supreme Court, they're called justices. The president appoints judges or justices to the judicial branch, but the Senate, which is part of Congress, it's the House of Congress where you have equal representation. Think back to the Great Compromise. You have a House of Representatives where representation is based on population, but the Senate every state gets equal representation, so the 50 states each get to send 2 senators for a total of 100. These senators have to approve of the president's appointments. So, the president, although he does get to appoint judges, the president just can't pick, his next door neighbor or his brother-in-law. The president has to appoint someone that's qualified, someone that will be approved by Congress. But once the judges get on the court, the judges can then rule that laws passed by Congress and the president are unconstitutional. All right, this power is called judicial review. That is the way that the judicial branch checks and balances powers. So, if you look over at that diagram on the screen, that gives another way of seeing and see how both, or not both, but all 3 of the branches, they have arrows going towards the other 2 branches, to each of the other 2 branches, and that's explaining how they're allowed under the Constitution to check and balance the power of those other branches. Okay. So, understand checks and balances. It's related to separation of powers, but it is different. Okay, separation of powers again just means that the powers are divided up among the branches. Checks and balances means that those branches can then also make sure that the other branches don't abuse their powers, don't try to take powers that aren't really theirs. They get to check and balance the powers of the other branches. All right, number 6, the 6th principle of the Constitution is limited government. And again, this is basically saying that our government can only do certain things. If you think back to a king, or think back to the leader of North Korea, they have unlimited power. They can do whatever they want. That's not the way our government's supposed to operate. Our government under the Constitution has limited powers, and essentially, it can only do those things that the Constitution says it can do. So this is the concept of limited government, and this is one of the principles that is set forth in the Constitution. That the government must act in limited ways. It can only do those relatively few things that the Constitution says it can do. That's the principle of limited government. And finally, 7, the Constitution protects the rights of the people. These are individual rights. This is the 7th principle. A lot of this comes about in the Bill of Rights, which we'll talk about in another lesson or two. Those were the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, but it's within the other parts of the Constitution in certain areas as well. All right, so again, there are 7 principles that are set forth by the Constitution: popular sovereignty, republicanism, federalism, separation of powers, checks and balances, limited government, and finally, individual rights. All right, know and understand those 7 principles. In our next lecture, we'll actually go through some of the actual terms of the Constitution and talk more specifically about what it says that the various branches of the government can do.